Welcome to the Royal Road School of Carmelite Prayer. Saint Teresa of Avila tells us that the divine path of Carmelite or silent prayer is the royal road to heaven, and that those who travel it will be given a great treasure. A link to the Praying with Teresa of Avila website has been provided below to enable you to easily find the Catalogue of Offerings on this channel, along with the notes, PowerPoint, and audio of today's presentation, The Beginnings of Contemplative Prayer, Chapter 2, God as Light, God as Love. The website provides all the simple tools that you need to develop your own practice of Carmelite or silent prayer, along with complete course materials to start your own school of prayer in your parish or community. The Beginnings of Contemplative Prayer, Chapter 2, God is Light, God is Love. From I'm a Daughter of the Church, Blessed Father Marie-Eugene. There are several differences between the first forms of supernatural prayer as described by Saint Teresa and that of Saint John of the Cross. Saint Teresa speaks of supernatural recollection and quiet, Saint John of the Cross of contemplation. Saint John requires the convergence of 3 signs as an indication of contemplation. Teresa only 1. The difference is really one of climate. Saint Teresa introduces us into an atmosphere that dilates the soul, while Saint John detains us in one where there is less warmth, where aridity, powerlessness, and often even disquiet seem to prevail. One could even wonder if Saint Teresa and Saint John are even talking about the same period of spiritual life. But there is no doubt that they are both speaking of the first manifestations of the supernatural action of God in prayer. There are characteristic points of agreement. Certain traits of Saint John's presentations seem to have been borrowed from Saint Teresa and vice versa. This article proposes to explain and reconcile these differences between these 2 teachers of the same school who at the Convent of the Incarnation in Avila collaborated closely in the spiritual direction of the nuns. Light and love in the mystical experience. Supernatural contemplation, that simple gaze of faith, perfected in its exercising the gifts, proceeds from a 2-fold supernatural activity, that of the soul and that of God. This 2-fold activity yields a 2-fold fruit, loving faith, and God gives a certain experience of himself and of his grace. The senses and the most exterior powers or faculties of the soul are the first to experience this interior action of God in the soul, which Saint Teresa compares to the flute, the call of the Good Shepherd. It is a call so delicate and gentle that the wandering faculties hardly hear it, but they recognize his voice and experience passive recollection, the first form of supernatural prayer. In the prayer of quiet and contemplative dryness, which allows recollection, God's action is experienced in the more interior faculties, the will and the understanding, or intellect. In the prayer of union, it is the center of the soul that is touched by God himself. Let's now explain the difference between the prayer of quiet of Saint Teresa and the contemplative dryness of St. John of the Cross. God is both light and love. These two attributes correspond to the two human faculties of the soul, the intellect or understanding, and the will. God is light to the intellect and to faith, grafted into it at baptism. God is love, or charity, to the will and to supernatural charity, grafted into it at baptism. On his side, God gives himself as light by the gift of understanding and is experienced as love by the gift of wisdom. It is then as light and as love that God will give himself in contemplation. St. John assures us that either light or love is dominant. The distinction is more marked and important in the first stages of contemplative prayer, in which divine action is received in the understanding or in the will. By looking at these two manifestations of God light and God love, the difference between St. John and Saint Teresa will be clarified. Light and the gift of understanding. St. John explains that God as light can only be experienced by the intellect or understanding. He writes, "The understanding, in its bodily prison, has no preparation or capacity to receive the clear knowledge of God." And the saint adds, "Thus, contemplation, whereby the intellect has the loftiest knowledge of God, is called mystical theology or secret wisdom of God." The human understanding is not fitted to perceive this divine light, yet it receives it and experiences it in the diverse effects that it produces. Let's point these effects out now. When divine light falls upon the intellect or understanding, it renders it incapable of consecutive thoughts. Writing of a person who has arrived at this stage, the saint says, "He can no longer meditate or reason with his imagination." This inability to meditate may result in a complete paralysis of the faculties. The powerlessness is accompanied by an uneasiness caused by the meeting of two contraries, the light of God and the impurities of the soul. This dark contemplation is, in its beginnings, painful to the soul. For as this divine infused contemplation has many excellences, the soul that receives them, not being purged, has many miseries that are extremely bad. Two contraries cannot coexist in one subject. The soul, it must of necessity have the pain and suffering as two contraries war against each other. A more complete inflowing of this divine light usually creates an impression of darkness and a confused and loving general knowledge. The general and loving knowledge which characterizes supernatural contemplation may be imperceptible not only at the beginning of the contemplative prayer, but also when the soul attains to great purity and perfect simplicity. The saint says, when the divine light strikes the soul with less force, it never perceives darkness, nor observes light. The soul remains in a great forgetfulness. This general knowledge is at times so subtle and delicate, particularly when it is most pure and simple and perfect, most spiritual and most interior, that though the soul may be occupied, it can neither realize it nor perceive it. This will be clearly understood by the following comparison. If we consider a ray of sunlight which enters through a window, the more the ray is charged with particles of matter, the more visible and bright it appears to the eye. If the ray were completely pure and free from all particles, it would appear completely dark and invisible to the eye, since all that could be seen would be absent from it. If there is no visible object in the sun's rays, nothing will be seen. So if the ray of light entered by one window and went out the other, without meeting anything having material form, it would not be seen at all. In sum, then, in this analysis of divine light, the divine light cannot be perceived because the soul has no faculty apt for receiving it. It can only experience the depriving effects of powerlessness, of suffering, or of darkness, painful effects, ordinarily infused with a sweetness that comes from love. 2. Love and the gift of wisdom. If the communication of God as light is privative and deceptive for the human faculties, those of God as love are positive and delightful. The disproportion between God and the human doesn't allow the understanding to perceive divine light, but does not hinder the will from experiencing God as love. For the will to love, a contact suffices. It matters not if the two beings united in love appear to one another on a certain plane of equality. Love effects its own work of union, making them equal. So the will and the senses can receive God love, unite with Him, and experience Him. In the first forms of contemplative prayer that we are speaking of here, the gift of wisdom allows one to experience not God Himself, but the gift of His charity that He makes to the soul. The prayer of quiet and the sleep of the powers are typical manifestations of God as love in the faculties of the soul. Unity of contemplation and the two contemplative gifts. Saint Teresa speaks of a delight and sweet love in the will. Saint John of the Cross speaks of a knowledge in the understanding, which is blinded by it. Are there two distinct forms of contemplation? One enlightening to the understanding according to Saint John of the Cross, the other full of love, that of Saint Teresa? To distinguish two forms of contemplation would run contrary to the very nature of contemplation and contradict the exposition set forth by Saint John of the Cross and Saint Teresa. To the two privative signs produced by the blinding effect of God's light falling on the faculties, Saint John of the Cross adds a third sign, the most certain and a positive one. He writes, "This third and surest sign is that the soul takes pleasure in being alone and waits with loving attention upon God. This third sign is closely allied to the quietude described by Saint Teresa, and Saint Teresa's description of quietude points out its privative effects in the understanding. She writes, "It may come about that the soul is enjoying the highest degree of quiet, and that the understanding has soared far aloft, that what is happening doesn't seem to be going on in its own house at all. It really seems to be a guest in somebody else's house, looking for other lodgings, since its own lodging no longer satisfies it, and it cannot remain there for long together." We find no more precise or picturesque a description in St. John of the Cross of the disarray of the understanding when the light strikes it. Saint Teresa often returns to this agitation of the understanding during the prayer of quiet, saying that the understanding must be treated like a madman. To further reduce the difference between the contemplation of Saint Teresa and that of Saint John of the Cross, one can affirm that during the long years in which she remained in aridity, unable to make use of her imagination or her understanding, Saint Teresa was in a contemplative state of which she perceived only the suffering. The saint had already been favored with the prayer of union, the memory of those graces, while rendering her faculties powerless, made her long for divine positive manifestations. Not knowing the nature and the value of these privative effects, she was only harassed by them, and awaited the outpouring of the gift of wisdom to speak of contemplation. The communication of God as light and as love are, with rare exceptions, concomitant or associated with one another in contemplation. Even in its early stages, it is by the communication of love that the soul first becomes aware of light in the understanding, according to St. John of the Cross. The third sign is necessary to determine the value of the other two. In conclusion, then, there is no essential difference in the manifestations of God as light and those of God as love. They are but reflections of divine attributes cast upon the soul, which produce different effects, but are the one identical essence of God. These different manifestations of God as light and as love are not in mutual opposition. Both St. John of the Cross and St. Teresa exchange their experiences with each other. These mutual confidences caused no trouble. Rather, they transported them both in common ecstasy. So then, there is only one sort of Christian contemplation which leads the soul to God, but which produces different effects in different souls. These differences do in fact occur. In an attempt to unify them, let's avoid trying to make them uniform. The manifestations of God light and God love, not excluding one another and being concomitant or coming together in each stage of contemplation, are revealed through forms of contemplation differing in tonality and spiritual climate. Their different method of exposition, descriptive in the case of St. Teresa, scientific in the case of St. John of the Cross, can't explain all their differences, however. These can be accounted for only by the difference in the experience. But a new problem presents itself when we ask ourselves why their experience was different. So let's take a look. Saint Teresa's experience and that of Saint John of the Cross. An easy explanation would be to attribute the differences simply to the action of God. We are indeed in the domain of the divine mercy. The divine God's pleasure would explain everything and would dispense us from further inquiry. But to attribute the differences to God and to his direct immediate action in souls, the different effects of contemplation would seem to leave out of account the divine ways of divine providence. God's action does in fact make use of natural means. It would seem that the difference in temperaments of Saint Teresa and Saint John of the Cross explain the particular form of their experience. God is an ocean from which each one draws according to the measure and the form of the vessel that he brings to it. Think then of Saint John of the Cross, an artist, but especially a thinker, a theologian, a philosopher, used to intellectual pursuits, and of Teresa, marvelously balanced with an ardent heart, refined sensibility, and a strong will. Is it not normal, then, that the same action should produce different effects? Whatever is received according to the mode of the recipient. When the prayer of union is reached, the faculties of the soul are deprived of their activity. But in the beginning of contemplative prayer, they can react in a personal way. From this divine communication, Saint John of the Cross draws mainly light, stressing its privative effects in the understanding, and that loving knowledge is produced in the depths of the soul. While Saint Teresa experiences the savor of pure love, emphasizes sweetness that captivates the will and arises from the inmost source, God. Does this solve the problem of the differences between the two saints in their exposition of the early stages of contemplative prayer? Can one conclude then that these manifestations of God as light and love, reaching at these early stages no further than the faculties, come from the same bright rays of the divine sun reflecting the different tones of the souls that receive them? Can the differences be explained by the differences in temperament of the souls who experience them? How could we make such an affirmation out of the mystery of God's direct and personal dealings with the soul, of which he jealously guards the secret? Considering a reasonable law of the divine action, a suggestion has been made that holds in many cases. In looking for God's actions in events, it is important to avoid two contrary errors. The one sees only natural causes for everything. The other view is seeing God's direct intervention in all things. An enlightened spirit knows how to discover the role of secondary causes in events and the primary role of God, who uses everything in the realization of his design. Despite the uncertainty, it is surely possible to base on them a judgment and practical directives for the life of prayer in our time. Today, there is widespread admiration for the marvelous richness of Saint Teresa's personality. Many souls are attracted by her prayer, yet it would seem that when they have made progress in mental prayer, they are usually more at home in the dry atmosphere of Saint John of the Cross's contemplation than in the pleasure of Saint Teresa's quietude. The choice is not theirs, as they would surely have chosen the fruitful riches of the spiritual mother than the detachment of the mystical doctor. But the modern soul, after the example of Teresa of the Child Jesus, the little flower, experiences more frequently the privative effects of contemplation. Feeling themselves poor in God's sight, they turn to Saint Teresa, and through her to St. John of the Cross. How to reconcile the sense of poverty in the presence of God? Could it be that civilization has made us intellectuals? The prideful intellect has extended its empire over all things, and so falling into agnosticism. The mind, dried up by its pride, is thirsty for life. Even in its relationship with God, it is proud and intellectual, and can accept only a light that dazzles and impoverishes it, but this time to purify and enrich it. Surely it was to meet this attitude and need of the modern soul that the Church declared St. John of the Cross, who was a mystical doctor of Carmel, a doctor of the universal Church. Amen.